The disciples had asked Jesus, "What will be the sign of your coming?" And after warning them not to be deceived by false teachers, he goes on, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'there,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, 'Look, he's in the desert,' do not go out. Or 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together." My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we share together these words that the Lord taught. From Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 to 28. He's talking about a time in the future. It's a time when the temple exists because the holy place is part of the temple. The temple was destroyed in AD 70 and has not yet been rebuilt on its site. We saw last time the prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, which in the first instance pointed to a historical person, Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple. But that was before Jesus came. And so Jesus is saying that kind of thing is going to happen again. Paul spelt that out a little bit. It was evidently part of the normal teaching of the early church, for Paul says he'd already told the Thessalonians this thing, and he'd only been with the Thessalonians a few weeks when he was driven out from there. But he said to them in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, "The day of the Lord will not come unless the departure comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things?" So there's a sequence of events here. We have the departure. Some take that as a departure from the faith, apostasy, and there's always been apostasy in the church. But it is the departure, and many take it as being what's elsewhere called the rapture, the calling up of the church to the Lord's presence. The man of sin, also known as Antichrist and the beast, is not revealed until after Christians are called up to meet the Lord in the air. He talked about that in 1 Thessalonians. After the departure, the man of sin will reveal himself and will proclaim himself as God. And then the day of the Lord, the day of judgment, will come. The key feature of this man of sin is that he will exalt himself. He will oppose all of God's people. He will exalt himself above all that is called God. And that's the character of the man described in the end of Daniel chapter 11 as well. Or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So this man will allow the temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. In fact, he will orchestrate it on the pretense that he is establishing peace in the Middle East, but only so that he can then go and sit there himself and say, "I am God." Now, this is what Jesus is then referring to as the abomination of desolation, a man claiming to be God. And he says, when you see this happen, then immediately the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem and surrounding must flee. He says, flee to the mountains. Now this flight is also referred to in Jesus' further revelation that John recorded for us in Revelation chapter 12, where it talks about a great sign, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a head a garland of 12 stars, which immediately remind us of Joseph's dream, the sun and the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. And this nation having a child, which is obviously the Lord Jesus Christ. And then a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head, drawing a third of the stars of heaven, throwing them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour the child as soon as it was born. So the child was the Lord Jesus. At his birth, Herod tried to have Jesus destroyed. Subsequently, Jesus was crucified by the Romans at the instigation of the Jews. We're told she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So now the Lord Jesus is in heaven, seated on the throne with the Father. The woman fled into the wilderness, where there was a place prepared by God that they should feed her 1,260 days. So we're now skipping forward. We've covered 4,000 years of history in those few verses, to the time when the woman flees. The Antichrist, this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, inspired by Satan, will seek to oppose her, and that's why she fled into the wilderness, according to what Jesus has told us. Now, when the dragon saw that he'd been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. And the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to the place where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time. This is 3.5 years, and again relates to one of Daniel's prophecies. It is the 1260 days. The serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. So here we have a very intense period of persecution against God's people, particularly against the Jewish people, inspired by Satan, with the man who proclaims himself to be God at the head of it. And Jesus says, when you see this man proclaiming himself to be God in the temple, then flee to the mountains. And they will. And God has prepared a place for them, whether at Petra or somewhere else, time will tell. And that tribulation period, the period was spelled out in Revelation 12 as being for 1260 days. But Jesus says unless those days were shortened, in other words, they're limited, it's not an extended period of time, it is a restricted period of time, no flesh would be saved. And the details of how Satan and the Antichrist seek to dominate the world and persecute anyone who would acknowledge God are recorded in the book of Revelation. So the warning is, if anyone says, look, here is the Christ or there, do not believe it. False Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Satan will come with great powers of deception, miracle-working powers. So just because somebody does something wonderful doesn't mean that they are the Christ. For this is the whole point of Jesus' prophecy. Don't be deceived by the false boasts of false Christs. See, I have told you beforehand. So how will we know who the true Christ is? Well, he says, as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. The coming of the Son of Man will be with such glory and power that it will be obvious to everybody simultaneously that he is the Lord. The birds will have a feast, cleaning up the mess.